Very nice to be here with you all this morning, where we're going to super geek out on one of my favorite topics, which is basically around how do we create an economy that serves people and planet. It's something that's motivated me for a long time. So I want to start by just telling a story of kind of where that motivation came from. And so a while ago, I counted as a young person, and I was a youth delegate with the UK Youth Climate Coalition for COP15. So we're on COP26 now, so it gives an idea of how long ago that was, which was in Copenhagen in 2009. And in the run up to that, there was a conference on at the Houses of Parliament, which was for Commonwealth countries and leaders of Commonwealth countries to come together and talk about the upcoming conference. At that, there was this, one of the key speakers was the then president of the Maldives, President Nasheed. He is an amazing speaker. So the two things you need to know, he's an amazing speaker, like literally can like rip your heart out of your chest and kind of make you just go, oh my goodness, like, you know, someone who can really get you understanding the fullness of what was going on. And the second thing was that he'd instituted a tourism tax. And the point of that tax was, as he told us in this very moving speech, was for the Maldives needed to buy land somewhere, and he was thinking about maybe Australia, because even under reasonable assumptions of climate change, the Maldives will cease to exist within our lifetimes. And he gave this amazing speech where he was talking about how climate change is an existential crisis, that the thought that them and their homes and the places where they've lived and their families have lived for, you know, hundreds of, if not thousands of years, is going to disappear underwater because of climate change. And the point he was making was that you can't negotiate with nature. You can negotiate in your political systems and you can negotiate in your economic systems, but you can't negotiate with nature. So he finishes the talk, everyone's, you know, wiping the tears away, like people are just looking at each other, just kind of with the full realization of the horror that is to come if we let climate change continue in the path that it's in. But what happened next was that, which was a really defining moment in my life, was somebody else came up on the stage, somebody called Gregory Barker, who was an MP, and he was shadow climate change secretary at the time to Ed Miliband's actual climate secretary. And he got up and he said something along the lines of, we'd love to say we could help more, but fiscally speaking, it's just not possible. And like, I was just horrified, because I was like, you know, if I'm being kind, you've really not read the room here. But B, that can't be right. Like what, but I didn't know what fiscal meant. I didn't know what this economic language meant. And so I didn't know how to argue back to that kind of argument. So I did what any reasonable person would do, and I went and did a PhD to basically to try and be able to beat Gregory Barker MP in an argument. I'm probably given a lot more credit, and he will have no idea how much he's transformed my life. But essentially, I went and did a PhD on how do we create a financial system that serves people and planet. And I dug into all of the theories about what is money, what is banking, like how does it work. So I looked anthropologically, I looked in sociology, I looked in political economy, like I looked at all of these different theories about what money is and how it worked. And I want to impart a little bit of that into you today, because our question is a green recovery, can we afford it? And I want to put a little bit of challenge into that question of can we afford it? Because I think that question, or questions similar to that, like how are we going to pay for that? And, you know, we hear it on the television over and over again, especially in the last 10 years. And basically, I want to tell you about something called modern monetary theory, which is kind of where positive money comes from. So Fran might go into some of the finer details, but I want to talk about it in the big terms, okay? So the reason why I think the question, can we afford it, is the wrong one is because of two myths about the economy and about money and how it works. And the first is that the government is a myth that the government is like a household. So we heard a lot of this, especially in the arguments for austerity, about oh, we can't afford, we can't afford to do this, you can't spend more than you bring in. And actually the first thing to know is, and it's a fact, and the Bank of England agrees with this, and you can go on Positive Money's website and read the ins and outs and the detail of this, but the basic story is governments who have control of their own money supply, which we do in the UK, we create pounds through the Bank of England. If you are in control of your money supply, there is no financial limit on how much money you can create. There may be limits on what you use that money for, and there may be some constraints around that, but there is no limit in terms of, we do not need to get back the same amount in sort of taxes and revenue as we spend into the economy. So that link we've been told is really strong is actually a myth, and that because we control our money supply, we aren't like a household, we are fundamentally different to a household. So that's the first thing. The second is that deficits are evidence of us overspending. So this is the idea, and so the best way to show it is, if the government is to spend £100 into the economy, okay, so whatever that is, if it collects £90 in taxes, then the deficit, which is this is the fiscal space, okay, so I know what it means now, and you all are going to know what it means. So fiscal basically means, like, it's when you're talking about government revenue, especially in terms of like taxes and public debt. So the difference between the £90 you get back in taxes and the £100 you've spent in is £10. Now, over the past 10 years, what people have been focused on is, well, wait, we've got a deficit, that gap of £10. But what I ask you to do is, let's zoom out from that narrow fiscal space and zoom out to see the wider economy. That £10 that the government isn't getting back is 10 extra pounds that is circulating in the economy. Now, it matters, of course it matters, who's got that £10 and what they're using that £10 to do in the economy is very, very important. But the point is that the government's deficit is the economy's surplus, right? That's extra money that's been created. And this is where you might have heard you might know about like Keynesian economics, which is the idea that when you're in a bust, so when the economy isn't doing very well and it's quite small, that's where the government has to increase its spending in order to put more money into the economy. Sorry, Mark, I just need to plug my computer in. And that's Keynesian economics. When the economy is not doing very well, the government has to spend to boost that. When the economy is doing really well, yeah, the government probably can spend less. So it's a cyclical thing. Okay, this is what we sort of talk about. So if those first two things are true, which they are, they're just facts about how the economy works. Like, when we look at that question, can we afford it? There are limits to what we can do, but I really urge you to start thinking not in these fiscal terms, not in these narrow financial terms, but in terms of what we can do in terms of ecological boundaries. Okay, so we're talking about a green recovery, and about human boundaries. Okay, like, so is anybody, hands up if you've heard of donut economics or you've seen that term around? So there's a few people on here, and the basic gist of that is that it's a different way to look at what it is, what's that economic space that we're operating in, that we should be focusing our policy on, that we should be focusing our spending on, that we should be focusing our aims for our world and for our countries on. And that conception is that you have this outer boundary, which is the planetary boundaries. Okay, so this is the thing that President Nasheed was saying about, we can't negotiate with those outer boundaries of what the planet can sustain. So, for example, while we've been arguing about whether we can afford it in these really narrow economic terms, what we've been doing is ignoring completely the really, really complex but necessary task of managing our scarce resources. So global average temperatures are on target to reach 4 degrees by 2100. 40% of our agricultural land is degraded. By 2025, it's estimated 2 out of 3 people in the world are going to live in a water-stressed state. And there is, I think, the equivalent of like a refuse truck of plastic being dumped into the ocean every single minute. And by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than there will be fish. These are the boundaries about whether we can afford to take action on climate change, whether we can afford to change our systems to be able to be within those ecological boundaries. And then the other boundary, I'll just finish off, is the human boundary. So there should also be, and donut economics are proposing the better way to think about it is there is a floor by which no human should fall below. So the space for our economic decisions, the space for a green recovery is about finding that balance between our ecological ceiling and that floor of humanity, and that's the space we should be operating in. Those are the constraints that we should have when we ask the question, can we afford it? And I think because of the examples I've just given, it's actually like we can't afford not to do a green recovery.